Namaste, Buna Ziwa. This is Nilufer Bharucha from the University of Mumbai. Before I start my presentation today, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to do this keynote presentation, especially Roxana Marinescu and Angelica Marinescu, who are not just colleagues, but also good friends. I also take this opportunity to extend my greetings to all the other friends and colleagues from Romania, who I have known for years now. And of course, my greetings to all the other organizers, the co-organizers of this conference. The presentation that I'm going to make today is on Indian women's writing from the past to the present. So I shall begin sharing my PowerPoint and take it from there. Give me a moment. Okay, so here we are. Indian women's writing from the past to the present. I'll begin with what I think is a very appropriate quotation from Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. Representation of the world, like the world itself, is the work of men. They describe it from their own point of view, which they confuse with absolute truth. Simone de Beauvoir said this in 1949. Countless women before her, as we will see in our presentation today, have said it before her, and women continue to say this even today. So it is very, very important that women have their own voices. As far as the history of women's writing in India is today is concerned, Indian women have been writing for a millennia, but their voices have been lost in a male-dominated world. So it's not a new phenomenon. Women writing in India is not a 20th century phenomenon or even a 19th century phenomenon. Indian women have been writing for over 1,000 years, but their voices have been lost. Now, this is being remedied by scholars today who are providing readers and especially students of literature with a balanced view as to writing being an activity undertaken by men as well as women. Now, this is very important because it provides women readers, women students, women academics with self-esteem when they realize that women are also writers, women are also historians, women are also scientists, not just men. And that literature, especially if you're a student of English literature, has been written not just by dead white European males who we jocularly or semi-jocularly call the dwems, the dead white European males. Women's writing, I think, should be moved to the center of literary discourse. It should be moved away from the margins where it has stagnated for ages, for centuries. Now, this is not just good for the self-esteem of women, but it is a corrective for a male-centric world and also for men, because you have very stereotypical masculinity notions as well in a male-centric world, and men are under immense pressure to acquiesce, to go along, to become like those masculine notions that a male-centric world provides them. So it's a corrective both for men as well as for women. Now, as far as the history of women's writing in India is concerned, there is an excellent publication by these two women, Susie Tharu and K. Lalita. And it's a 2-volume publication collection. It starts from 600 years before Christ or before the Common Era, if we use the word CE, and goes on to the present time, to the 20th century, not really coming up to the 21st century. So I'll be doing a lot of reference to the work that Susie Tharu and K. Lalita have done in this 2-volume publication. Now, what they have noted in their introduction to women writers in ancient India is that There is definitely a paucity of female voices. You don't find so many female voices represented in the Vedic period as far as Indian writing is concerned. It is more male dominated. Vedic traditions were more male dominated. And those of you who are familiar with Indian Vedic scholarship would know that there are 4 Vedas, namely the Rig Veda, the Samveda, the Yajur Veda, and the Atharva Veda. Now, this doesn't mean that there were no women scholars, there were no female scholars. There were female scholars, there were female mathematicians, there were female philosophers, but not in equal number, nowhere in equal number to the men in the Vedic period. There were far and few in between. Women like Gosha, Lopamudra, Sulabha Maitre, and of course Gargi. You may have heard of some of these names. There's also this problem of Sanskrit, the language of the Vedas, or the Vedas which began as oral literature. When they were actually transcribed into the written form, they were transcribed into Sanskrit. Now, Sanskrit was the language of religion, the Sanskrit was the language of the court in India, and few women would have had access to Sanskrit. They would have spoken in Prakrit, and they wouldn't have spoken in Sanskrit. But there are some records of writings by women, even in Prakrit. And one such record that we have is by the scholar Avanti Sundari in the 9th century after Christ and the Common Era. And she wrote in Prakrit. But of course, we are coming into a much later period than the Vedic one that I have already spoken about. There is also record of Buddhist nuns, and there is record of Tamil women scholars who have written, who are available, who have written themselves into existence. And the Buddhist women were mainly nuns who have written, and they have written in Pali, mainly in Pali. First, it was oral literature and then transcribed into Pali. And there is a very famous collection of poems or hymns, if you want to call them that, but they were mainly poems written by Buddhist nuns. And this collection is known as Therigatha, and it dates back to the 6th century before Christ. And there is also the Tamil collection of poems from the Sangam period, which stretches from 100 years before Christ or even before that to 250 years in the Common Era. So now the poems in the Therigatha, the poems written by the Buddhist nuns, as I said, were originally composed in Magadhi and then written in Pali. So the language of the people, the spoken language, and then in the more literary language of Pali. The literature of the Sangam period, which is in Tamil, Tamil is like Sanskrit, a classical language. There's several women writers in the Sangam period in writing in Tamil. And there are at least 3 women writers whose writing has come down to us. We have them on record, and they did not use their own names. They used the pen name, and the pen name was Avaiyar. Avaiyar in Tamil actually means a respectable woman. Any respectable scholarly woman was an Avaiyar. Now, there were several Avaiyars in that whose recorded writing that we have in the Sangam literature period. The first Avaiyar lived during the Sangam period, the first Sangam period, around the 3rd century before Christ, and of course wrote poems, and they are available in Purana Nuru, an anthology of poetry. Let us look at this poem. I mean, I don't really have the time to read out to you or to familiarize you with all the poems written by these extraordinary women from way, way, way back in the past, our foremothers. But this is one of the poems. I'll read out one of the poems from the Therigatha collection by the Buddhist nuns. Very subversive, very, very subversive poem, subversive of patriarchy and very challenging poetry. So freed, so thoroughly freed am I. From 3 crooked things I have been set free. From mortar and pestle, the mortar and pestle, the things that women have to grind in the kitchen, and crooked old husband. See the way the crooked old husband is associated with the household drudgery. Having uprooted the craving that leads to becoming, I'm set free from aging and death. And this is by somebody called Mutta, who signs herself as Mutta. One of the poems from the Sangam period, written in Tamil, we don't have the name of the author. She was one of the Avaiyas. Real learning. Real learning is that which places you in the state of deathlessness. And real food is what you consume when you are totally liberated and where you are not under any command and where you are neither slave nor servant. The condition of most women, whether they were women of the court or they were women from poor or middle class homes. I'm going to now leap several centuries into the Bhakti movement. So that was the Sangam movement coming down to the 10th century, and that's a later Sangam movement. And now we are into the Bhakti movement, which is early medieval and then medieval. Now the Bhakti movement in the south of India actually began much before the Bhakti movement in the north of India. So you have the Bhakti movement in the 7th century in Anno Domini, which gained momentum in the 12th century and continues right down to the 7th century. So you have a very long period when you speak of the Bhakti movement. As I said, it first arose in the south and then moved upwards into the north. Now, what was unique about this movement, the Bhakti movement, is that it included lower caste men and women belonging to different strata of society. Now, what was the Bhakti movement all about? The Bhakti movement, Bhakti means devotion, prayer. So the Bhakti movement was a direct connection. The Bhakti poets, the Bhakti sons, or saints as they were called, wanted a direct connection with the divine, with divinity, without the mediation of men from the priestly class. So this was what they wanted, a direct connection with divinity without the mediation of the priestly caste, which was the Brahmin caste. This was Bhakti, devotion. And the Bhakti saints wrote in different languages, the languages of the people. They did not write in Sanskrit. The saint poets of this movement also wrote in different local languages, not just the more literary languages, non-Sanskrit literary languages, but in the language of the people. They wrote in the vernacular. So this was a movement which was focused upon the people, the common people. And like with the earlier literary movements, which we have just spoken about, many of these poems began as part of the oral tradition and then were written down either by the poets themselves or their followers or their devotees in later centuries to follow, maybe even during the lifetime of the poets themselves. Now, these Bhakti poets were shunned by upper caste, male-dominated society. They didn't have an easy time because they had dared to transgress into what was seen as Brahmin, masculine Brahmin strongholds of religion and worship, which was denied to both the lower castes as well as to women of all the castes. So obviously there was a resistance to this particular type of poetry, this particular movement, the Bhakti movement, which was seen as part of a resistance movement. And a lot of Bhakti poetry is studied today as resistance poetry. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the Hindu gods and goddesses, this is a very old sculpture from a cave near Mumbai, Elephanta Caves. And this sculpture is of the Trinity, the Hindu Trinity of Brahma, the creator, who is on this side, the left-hand side. Then in the center is Vishnu, the preserver. And on the right-hand side is Shiva, the destroyer. And then there is also a painting, which is more from the Puranic period. It is more calendar art type of painting, where the bearded deity is Brahma, the deity in the center is Vishnu, and the deity on the other side of Vishnu is Shiva. Then you have the counterparts, the feminine counterparts of the Hindu gods. The feminine counterpart of Brahma, the creator, is Saraswati, the goddess of knowledge, because you cannot create without knowledge. So that is Saraswati, the goddess of knowledge. In order to preserve, to live life, you need wealth. So Lakshmi is the goddess of wealth. And the destroyer needs Kali, the Shakti, the goddess with the power to destroy. So here you have the two, there are several manifestations of Durga, Kali. Kali is her most horrific manifestation, the strongest, more horrific manifestation. And this is the more peaceable, but still very strong manifestation of Durga. There's also the manifestation as Parvati. There's also the caste system, for those of you who are not familiar with the Hindu caste system, because I said that the Bhakti period, the Bhakti movement resisted the Brahmin caste hegemony. So you have the four castes in the Hindu caste system: the Brahmin, the Kshatriya, the Vaishya, the Shudra. And the lowest of the low among the Shudras were the Dalits. Today they are self-named themselves, self-defined as Dalit, the lowest of the low, those who are sort of crushed into the earth by the oppressions of the upper caste. The Bhakti women poets. Let's look at the Bhakti women poets, because it was a movement of both lower caste men as well as women. Now, unlike the nuns or the Avyars of the earlier period, the Therigata nuns or the Avyars of the Sangam period, the Bhakti women poets were mainly householders. And they wrote of their domestic lives, they wrote of the chores that they had to undertake every day. And of course, some of them were mendicants. Some of them had moved away from domesticity and from married lives. One of the earliest Bhakti women poets that we have from the south of India, remember it started in the south of India, the Bhakti movement, is Akamma Devi. Akamma Devi, there are many stories about Akamma Devi, and today Akamma Devi has kind of been appropriated by the upper caste. But of course, she's also been taken in as a kind of a feminist icon. And many of these women that I'm going to mention now have become post-colonial feminist, third world feminist icons or Indian feminist icons, and a lot has been written about these women Bhakti poets. There is Akamma Devi from Karnataka, one of the earliest. There is Janabai from Maharashtra, and she was from the lowest of the lowest caste, and she worked as a servant in the house of one of the male Bhakti poets. There's, of course, Mirabai, who belonged to a different class, who belonged to the Kshatriya caste, not the Shudra caste. And she was a Rajput princess, which is a slightly different category from among the other Bhakti poets who, generally speaking, almost all of them, apart from women like Mirabai, belong to the lowest of the lower caste. There's also Bahinabai from Maharashtra. So there are many women poets from the in the Bhakti movement, and they generally came from the lowest of low castes. Here you have a picture, of course, these are representations. These are not real pictures or not real paintings. There is a real life painting, it is said, of Mirabai, the Rajput princess whose miniature would have been painted in the Rajput tradition. But apart from Mirabai, we don't have any real life representations of these women. You have Akamma there on the top with her hair, long hair covering her body. And it is believed that she went around without any clothes, just her hair covering her body. Because, of course, women are connected to the body. The body of the woman becomes a source of lust, and also violence is perpetrated upon the body of the woman. And men lust after the body of the woman. And that is why, of course, women have to be kept protected from the evil male gaze. So Akamma refused to bow down to that. She went without any clothes. We have a poem from Akamma. There is Janabai, the Maharashtrian woman Bhakti saint. They were all called saints, sant. And there is Bahinabai, who is yet another Maharashtrian. The Maharashtra was also, apart from the south, Maharashtra was also a great cauldron of resistance as far as Bhakti writing is concerned, especially women. There were also the great Maharashtrian male Bhakti sons like Tukaram and Namdev and Jnaneshwar. But these were the great women, sons of the Bhakti period from Maharashtra. Akamma writing about her unclothed form. If the cloth that covers them slips, men and women become shy. If you, Lord of life, envelop the whole world, what is there to be shy of? If Channamallikarjuna, another name for Shiva, jasmine tender, sees with the whole world as eyes, the whole world are the eyes of Channamallikarjuna, what shall you cover and where shall you hide, O man? And then there is another one here. Janabai. This is one of Janabai's most famous poems, Cast Off All Shame, which has really been taken almost as an anthem by a lot of women feminists who use this, these lines or this title of Janabai's Marathi poem, Cast Off All Shame. Cast off all shame and sell yourself in the marketplace. Then alone can you hope to reach the Lord. Cymbals in hand, got pictures of the cymbals, the things which make the ting-ting noise. And a veena, the stringed instrument, upon my shoulder, go about. Who dares to stop me? The pallav of my sari, the covering on the shoulder, the pallav of my sari falls away, a scandal. Yet will I enter the crowded marketplace without a thought. Jana says, my Lord, I have become a slut to reach your home. Cast off all shame. And I've got a picture of, I mean, this of course is not Janabai throwing her pallav down. This is the way in which women are exploited in the commercial advertising world. Here you have a picture of a woman, modern day woman with postmodern day woman with a sari on her, pallu on her shoulders, and then the pallu slips a little to expose a little bit of the cleavage, all right? Mirabai, I will not go into the Mirabai poem. Mirabai is part of the popular culture and also high culture today. So a lot of Mirabai has gone into, I mean, Mirabai is part of the film world today and film songs. You find tremendous number of Mirabai bhajans. Bhajans are devotional songs on YouTube. And even Janabai and Akamma Devi and many of these Bhakti saints, women Bhakti saints, their poems, their songs, whether in Marwari or in Gujarati or in Marathi or whichever, Tamil, they are there on YouTube. They're part of the popular culture today. And they are heard and listened to not just by the feminist type of women, but by men and women in general. So this is in the digital era, we have this kind of taking up of these Bhakti saints and putting them into the public domain. The Mughal period, it's interesting, and I've deliberately focused on the Mughal period as well, or brought in the Mughal period as well, because it was believed that the Islamic woman was in Parda, always hidden away and had nothing to do with intellectual pursuits, but that is not true. The women writers of the Mughal period, although the recorded ones, the ones that we really know about, were from the aristocratic, from the princely classes. They were the sisters and daughters and mothers and wives of the Mughal emperors, but there were also women from middle classes and women who were wives and sisters and whatever of the later day Urdu poets, at least, if not the Persian poets of the early Mughal period, who also wrote, and we have some of their works on record. Now let us go back to the Mughal emperors and their women. Now remember, when the Mughals came to India first, their women rode with them, their women fought with them. They were warriors in the battlefield as well. Now Gulbadan Begum was the sister of Emperor Humayun, and she's one of the very few Mughal women who have written the history of the Mughal court. And she has written the Humayun Nama, the life of Humayun, the court of Humayun, Emperor Humayun, her brother. And she, of course, she lived in the Zanana, but she was a free woman. She moved around, she had her own business, she had her own income, and she was one of the few Mughal women who, I mean, there are a lot of Mughal women who went for Hajj to Mecca, but she took an all-women's Hajj to Mecca, and she boarded several ships which were owned by her, and she negotiated with the Portuguese, who were already in India, on the western shores of India, and were already beginning to dominate the traffic between the shores of Arabia and the western shores of India. So that was Gulbadan Begum. Emperor Jahangir's last wife, Noor Jahan, was, of course, a force to reckon with. She issued coins in her own name, farmans. Her picture was on the coins of the Mughal Jahangir's period. A very, very powerful woman. We don't really have much information on what she wrote, but she would have definitely written farmans or have reports written by her presented to the emperor. Jahanara was Emperor Shah Jahan's favorite child, and she was a Sufi poet in her own right. She also commissioned poetry, she commissioned translations, and she wrote a biography of her Sufi master, Mullah Shah. And she also wrote a biography of the Sufi saint, another Sufi saint, a great favorite with all the Mughal emperors, Muinuddin Chishti. The niece of her niece was Emperor Aurangzeb, the last most powerful Mughal emperor before they went into a decline. The Mughal emperors went into a decline. His daughter, Zeb-un-Nisa, who was the niece of Jahanara, she herself was an accomplished scholar, and she was a patroness of art. She was a poet. She was also her father's favorite until she fell out of favor because she favored some of her brothers and her uncles over Emperor Aurangzeb, and he imprisoned her for the last 20 years of her life. These are some pictures, and these are real paintings. We don't know how real they were in the sense and how flattering they were for the royal patrons or the royal patronesses. There is Gulbadan Begum, who looks fairly formidable. Then Empress Noor Jahan, Jahanara Begum, Zeb-un-Nisa Begum. These are all paintings which are available, miniatures which are available. We're going to now leap into the British colonial period, the women writers of the Reform period. The 19th century is known as the Reform period in India. It is also known as the Bengal Renaissance period. There was also a Renaissance not just in Bengal, but also in Maharashtra. This is a time when women's education, upliftment of women, resistance to caste hierarchies, and a kind of a reform of the Hindu religion, not just the Hindu religion, but various Indian religions or religions which were prominent in India was taking place. It was known as the Reform period. One of the important women in the Reform periods was Savitribai Phule. She was a 19th century pioneer of women's education in India, along with her husband Jyoti Rao Phule. And she wrote poetry, she wrote prose, she was a leading educationist. And some of her poetry is very, very resistant poetry, very challenging poetry. And even today, Savitribai Phule is very well acknowledged by Indian feminists and Indian educationists in India. Her collaborator, though, is not as well known. Her collaborator was this woman called Fatima Sheikh, who was also an educationist who worked with Jyotiba Phule and Savitribai Phule, and she was the sister of the man in whose house Jyotiba and Savitribai were tenants. She took up the education of Dalit children in Phule's school. The Phule started a school for the lower caste children, and Fatima Sheikh was one of the teachers of these Dalit children. Another important reformist woman of that period was Pandita Ramabai. Again, there's a lot of interest in Pandita Ramabai's work today with third world feminists, with Indian feminists, intersectional feminists. So there's a lot of interest in Pandita Ramabai's work. Pandita means a woman scholar, so Pandita Ramabai. And she married outside her community and caste. She traveled widely in India. She traveled abroad. She had contacts with educational organizations. She studied medicine, and interestingly enough, she converted to Christianity. She set many precedents for successive feminists, not only among the Hindus, but also Indian women in general. The most important publication of Pandita Ramabai is the High Caste Hindu Woman, published in 1887, and which exposed all the gender oppressions which happen in the guise of traditions and custom. This is what we do. This is our tradition. This is our custom. Women should behave like that. Women should dress like that. Women should do this, do that. Traditions, guise of traditions and customs. Oppressions in the guise of traditions and customs. Bengali women, of course, the Bengal Renaissance was as important, or what was in fact the titular kind of Renaissance at that time in India, 19th century, and Bengali women contributed to the literature of the Renaissance and literature of the Reform. One such Bengali writer was Ruqayya Shekhawat Hussain, and her long work, The Sultana's Dream, is again become quite an iconic text, and many gynocritics see it as utopian feminist writing, early utopian feminist writing. It's fantasy, so early utopian feminist writing. And the writings of these women who I have just listed could also be seen as the first wave, the writings by the first wave of Indian feminists, the first wave of Indian feminism, in quite independent of what was happening in the West. The West, you already had the, towards the end of the 19th century, even before that, with Mary Wollstonecraft, and coming down into the 19th century, you had the suffragette movement, which had started, you had the new woman movement, which had started. But apart from the women, Indian women who went to the West, like Ramabai, these challenges and resistances from amongst the Indian women took place independently to a large extent of the Western feminist or the early Western feminist movements. Some pictures of these women: Savitribai Phule, her colleague and collaborator Fatima Sheikh, Ruqayya Shekhawat, Pandita Ramabai. These are, of course, many of them were photographs or paintings done from photographs, because by that time you were into the age of photography. Now, the nationalist period. So after the end of the reformist period, end of the 19th century, you are in the nationalist period in India. Going back to the book that I spoke of right at the beginning of this presentation, Tharu and Lalita's Women's Writing in India, in their introduction, they say that, Tharu and Lalita have said in their introduction, that women in this period, in the nationalist period, were empowered by the task of freeing the nation from foreign rule. So their female gender, their feminine selves were kind of kept in abeyance because they were helping with the nationalist struggle of India. So there was a kind of upliftment of women in this period, part of the endeavor. Of course, remember, Gandhi has returned to India in 1915, and with Gandhi bringing women out of their homes onto the streets, making them part of the nationalist struggle. A lot of women came out of their homes and were able to move out for the first time. Of course, you find this represented in the writings later on of R.K. Narayan and Raja Rao Skandhapura, etc. Of course, Mulk Rajanan and many other Indian writers in English of that period, the nationalist period. But I'm not talking only of Indo-English writers. I'm talking about writers from different Indian languages now. So writers such as Nirupama Devi wrote immensely popular Bengali novels, which were very traditional, but had the strength and influence of women very strongly represented. There were writings of Mahadevi and Subhadra Kumari Chauhan in Hindi. Dhiruben Patel wrote in Gujarati, Balmani Amma wrote in Malayalam, and several other women wrote in other Indian languages. Remember, India is a multilingual country. Women were not only writing about the nationalist movement and about the upliftment of women at this time, but they also joined the nationalist movement. Many of these writers were actually activists. They joined the nationalist movement in huge numbers and were at the forefront of two very important nationalist movements at this time. One was the Salt Satyagraha of 1930, and the other was the Quit India movement of 1942. So women were right in the forefront of these two movements. One such woman who was both a writer as well as a political activist was Sarojini Naidu. She wrote in English, and Gandhi called her the Nightingale of India. And she was also his court jester. Again, he called her his court jester. And she was the only woman in the entire coterie around Gandhi who had the temerity to question the man and also to poke fun at him. She poked fun at several things which Gandhi did, such as his dietary habits, the fact that he traveled third class on Indian railways, etc., etc. And Sarojini Naidu had once said that it costs the British Indian government tremendous amount of money to keep Gandhi in poverty, i.e. travel in the third class. These are the pictures of some of these women: Sarojini Naidu, Mahadevi Verma, Nirupama Devi, Subhadra Kumari Chauhan, Balmani Amma, Dhiruben Patel. It's important for us to sing their names, to celebrate their names, and to also know what they looked like. Then we come to the second wave of women writers in the 20th century. Now, the second wave of women writers, Indian women writers, was spearheaded by women such as Ismat Chugtai, Amrita Pritam, Krishna Sokti. Ismat Chugtai wrote in Urdu, Amrita Pritam in Punjabi, Krishna Sokti in Hindi. Now, their works, the works of these women, explored several boundaries or crossed several boundaries of the bodies, boundaries of sexualities, and they were negotiating their own place as women in a new nation, still smarting from the fresh wounds of partition, because the wounds of partition, unfortunately, remain unhealed in India today, which is a tragedy. But at that time, when they were writing, they were extremely fresh wounds. Chugtai was known very especially for her radical feminist views, and her story Lihaf led to her persecution under the obscenity laws. And it was just the cusp of India's freedom and, of course, the partition itself. And she was tried under the obscenity laws. Of course, nothing came of it, but she was tried. And what was it all about? Kind of unsaid hinting about lesbian relationships. So she was tried under the obscenity laws. But fortunately for her, lesbianism is not a criminal offense under the Indian Penal Code, because it wasn't a criminal offense under the British Penal Code. So Ismat Chugtai got away with it, right? Now that's another story. Now these women, unlike the women of the Reform period, these women were not totally innocent of Western feminism, but they were not inordinately, overtly impacted by Western feminist ideology. So they were writing at a time when in most Western countries, after a long battle, women had got the vote, or most women had got the vote. They were aware of it, but they were not overtly impacted. These are the women. Ismat Chugtai also wrote for Bombay cinema. Krishna Sokti, Amrita Pritam, Mahashweta Devi. Mahashweta Devi we are coming to in a moment. Now, coming to the early post-colonial Indian feminist writers. India became independent of British colonialism in 1947. So we are talking about women in the 1950s and women in the 1960s, or maybe even up to the 1970s, the Nehruvian period. 1960s, 50s, and 60s. Now, foremost among the other feminist writers of the early post-colonial period, Sopti continues to write, Krishna Sopti, her novel Mitro Marjani, 1966. Amrita Pritam continues to write, 1950. Kamla Das's, the poet Kamla Das's autobiography, My Life, written both in Malayalam as well as in English, 1973. Mashweta Devi's Breast Stories, translated from the Bengali by Gayatri Spivak, 1997. So this is much later, the translations come much later. Now these women, who, as I've already said, and the women who we are talking about now, were more ideologically engaged in feminist issues. And although like Mashweta Devi, many like Mashweta Devi did not describe themselves as feminists, and many Western writers who we call feminists or study them under the rubric of feminism do not describe themselves or do not agree to the description by critics that they are feminist writers for various reasons. We won't go into that today. Her translator, Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak, one of her translators, not the only translator, defines herself, of course, Gayatri Spivak is also known for her connection with Derridian deconstruction. So Gayatri Spivak defines herself as a Marxist feminist, and she tries to maybe, I don't know, wouldn't dare to say that, but maybe in a way imputes these ideological constructs to her favorite author, Mashweta Devi, who is today no more. The new generation of Indian women writers and feminism. Now we have many new generation Indian, by new generation, I mean post-colonial, going back to the 70s, 80s. Anita Desai, Shashi Deshpande, Bharti Mukherjee, with whose writing some of you may be familiar. They have also, many of them, denied any feminist bias in their writing, but analysis by scholars, academics, students, researchers show a very strong feminist intent and focus on women's issues as a chief concern in their plots. There are also a more recent group of Indian women writers, and many of whom are now writing from the diaspora. The Indian diaspora is 25 million strong, and you have a fairly substantial number of Indians living in Romania as well. So you would know that the Indian diaspora has its tentacles all around the world. So you have Arundhati Roy, Geeta Hariharan, Namita Gokhale, although the Romanian Indian diasporics haven't produced any literature as such, but we shall wait and see what comes out of it. So going back to what I was saying, Arundhati Roy, Geeta Hariharan, not diasporics, Namita Gokhale, Anita Nair, a diasporic, Manju Kapoor, Shona Singh Balwin, a diasporic, Jhumpa Lahiri, a diasporic. They are more upfront about their feminist bearings and the feminist ideologies that come through in their writing. In other languages too, in India, we have many writers today, many post-colonial, in a sense, kind of feminist writers, such as Alka Saraogi, writes in Hindi, very, very post-colonial writing, and who writes both from the male as well as female perspectives. Very few women write from the male perspective, and she's one of them. And she writes about the Marwari diaspora in Calcutta in Bengal. There are some pictures here: Anita Desai, Arundhati Roy, Anita Nair, Shashi Deshpande, Geeta Hariharan, Jhumpa Lahiri, Bharti Mukherjee, Shona Singh Baldwin, Alka Saraogi. Once again, in the feminist tradition, we name the names. These are not our foremothers, these are our sisters, all right? So we name their names. Now, another aspect of writing by women today, which is very important, is rewriting from a feminist perspective. And with this, I will bring my presentation to an end. Rewriting from a feminist perspective, stories from the Indian epics, the Ramayana and Mahabharata. Ramayana and Mahabharata, the Indian epics, like epics anywhere in the world, are very male-centric. So there are many women writers who have been rewriting the epics from a woman's point of view, if not an outright feminist point of view. One of the most visible ones that you might have even heard of is Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni's The Palace of Illusion. Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni writes from the US, Indian diasporic from the US. It's a feminist retelling of the Mahabharata, and she writes it from the point of view of Panchali, Draupadi, and her Panchali is a sharp, witty, brave woman. She has a dark complexion which breaks the conventional challenges, the conventional Indian notions of beauty. Beauty being fair, you have to be fair in order to be beautiful. And of course, Panchali has a very assertive personality. There is Iravati Karve's Yuganta, written in Marathi and translated into English and several other languages. It's again from the Indian epic. It's from the Indian epic Mahabharata, again, like the Palace of Illusions. And she creates a very human persona for the characters from Mahabharata. And she writes about the end of the Mahabharata epic, the end of an era, Yuganta, the end of an era. Then there are very, very new kinds of retellings from in the digital media, especially in the form of graphic novels. There is Samita Arni's Ramayana. It's a rewriting of the Ramayana from Sita's point of view. She's not the only one who's done this. Several women before her in different languages have already done it, different Indian languages, but hers is a graphic novel which goes straight into the heart of the digital world and becomes available, becomes visible to the younger, newer millennial generation, the millennials. And then there is also her Missing Queen, which is about the banishment of Sita from the court of Ram in Ayodhya. And After Kurukshetra is a collection of 3 short stories written by Mashweta Devi, who we have already spoken about, the fiery Bengali Marxist activist. And this is not translated by, these stories are not translated by Gayatri Spivak. They've been translated, I think, by Anjum Khayal or Katyal. I'm sorry, I forget the translator's name. So these are the 3 stories taken after the end of the battle of Mahabharata, and there almost all the Kauravas have died except one illegitimate prince, and all the 5 Pandava princes are alive, but all their children and grandchildren have died. The queens, of course, are alive, but the widows of the Kaurava, the women of the Kauravas are all widows. They had 100 sons and 5 on one side, 5 versus 100, the 5 win because they had right ethics on their side. Another story. All right, so after Kurukshetra is a set of stories which raises very important questions about the situation of surviving women after the Kurukshetra. After Kurukshetra is the name of the battlefield where the great war of Mahabharata takes place. And it philosophizes about the male-centric nature of war and its impact on women, on the widows left behind after the men have died. Not just the queens of the Kauravas, but the women of the common, the widows of the common soldiers. Also focuses on the different status of aristocratic and proletariat women of that period, who Mashweta Devi refers to as Janvritta, the proletariat, and Rajavritta as the aristocratic courtly women. Here are some pictures of some of the tales that I referred to, the retellings. Chitra Divakaruni's Palace of Illusion, Iravati Karve's Yuganta, Mashweta Devi's After Kurukshetra stories, and Samita's, Sita's Ramayana. So this brings me to an end of my presentation. So I will thank you. I will say Dhanyavad in Hindi, Shukriya in Urdu, and sorry, let me try that again. Mulzumes in Romanian. I think I have got it correct. So thank you very much.